Hi students, this is Dr. Esmacher. Happy day before Thanksgiving as of this recording. I figured that it would be low attendance today, so I'm going to talk to myself about the lost cause, and y'all can watch later. Let me go ahead and load on the PowerPoint. So this week we've been covering the Civil War, and the lost cause myth of the Civil War is something that straddles both the Civil War period and Reconstruction. So we won't get to Reconstruction until next week, but I did want to go ahead and talk about the Lost Cause mythology because this is definitely something that affects us in our coverage of this week. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about what exactly we mean by the lost cause. So the lost cause is a way of remembering the Civil War that emerges after the end of Reconstruction. So according to this way of remembering the Civil War, the lost cause has a couple of claims. So the first claim is that the South, in fighting the Civil War, did not fight to preserve the institution of slavery. That instead, the South fought the Civil War solely to preserve state and local rights. That they felt that the national or federal government was dictating too much to them what they should do, that they had too much power, and that's why they were fighting against the North or the Union. The second claim of the lost cause is to double down on the issue of slavery and to restate that slavery was not at all a factor in the war. Again, not a factor in starting the war, not a factor in perpetuating the war. The third claim positions the war in the face of religion, particularly depicting the Confederacy as godly and the Union as evil. It casts Reconstruction, or the time period of rebuilding the nation, and particularly the South after the Civil War, as a time of horrible things happening, and that it was a time filled with rampant or prevalent corruption, particularly by Southern state governments and specifically by African Americans, who during the period of radical Reconstruction from 1867 to 1877 were part of these Southern state governments. So, according to the Lost Cause, in a nutshell, the South fought the Civil War to preserve state rights, that slavery was not an option, that this Confederacy was a noble government with noble goals, and that they simply kind of lost, right? And that after they lost the Civil War, the South was further victimized by evil, corrupt governments at the Southern state level led by African Americans. The lost cause is still something that exists today. You will still find people who believe in the lost cause about the Civil War. In fact, if you've ever seen this flag here, the Confederate flag, if you've ever seen arguments over the appropriateness of displaying the Confederate flag, folks who use the line heritage, not hate, usually are folks who buy into the lost cause. For a lot of people, the Confederate flag represents the symbol of fighting to preserve slavery, and therefore it's considered a hate symbol for a lot of folks, including African Americans. For others, they go, no, this is just a symbol of our Confederate heritage, that we were fighting for state rights. Okay. So how does this way of remembering the Civil War come about? A couple of different things. Southerners were still trying to process the Civil War and their loss in the Civil War. In particular, if you shift to thinking about the Civil War as a war to preserve state rights rather than to preserve enslaving other human beings, then you feel better about yourself and your participation in the war. So some of this was people who had fought in the South trying to make themselves feel better about fighting by changing the reason for fighting to something that was less controversial or racist. Part of this is on the behalf of people still today who, right, say the Confederacy was about heritage, not hate. It was about Southern culture and a way of life and not enslaving African Americans. Those folks are trying to kind of burnish or polish the memory of their ancestors who fought in this conflict. The other thing that gives rise to the lost cause is this desire to move on past the Civil War, especially when Reconstruction ends in 1877. There's this movement to try to kind of erase the sharp and bitter divide that was caused by the Civil War by remembering it differently. Rather than it being a very bitter conflict over whether states could secede, over whether people could continue to enslave other human beings. This is now the time period where the Civil War gets recast as a family feud, like a tragic conflict of brother versus brother, sometimes literally. We do see that happen in the Civil War, families torn apart and on different sides of the conflict. So this way of remembering the Civil War as kind of a disagreement and not a sort of die-hard, bitter to the death referendum on things like union and what the Constitution means. This is a way to try to move on past Reconstruction, particularly when we start to see, after the end of Reconstruction, the rebirth of white supremacy in the South. When Reconstruction ends, there's a group, and we'll talk about this more next week when we cover Reconstruction in our class. Part of what happens is there's this group called Redeemers who saw Reconstruction as a horrible thing for the South. They gain experience, political experience and capital by people being disgruntled over Reconstruction. So they start to gain political power. They're the ones who kind of sway in the 1876 presidential election, which is contested. They're the ones who sway it in favor of Rutherford B. Hayes if he will end Reconstruction and what's called the corrupt bargain of 1876. These folks want to completely undo the gains of Reconstruction, particularly the gains made by both African Americans who could now vote and hold political office, and also poor white people who now were increasingly doing the same. And so they wanted to kind of reinstall elite white folks as the power brokers, both sort of officially and unofficially in the South. And these people, in order to kind of revert the South as close as they can to the way it used to be before the Civil War, they can't undo the 13th Amendment. We can't reinstitute slavery, but they can find creative ways to reinstitute white supremacy in the legal system. And that leads to the rise of Jim Crow segregation, or laws mandating the separation of white and non-white people. And again, we'll talk about that more when we talk about Reconstruction in more detail next week. So, pardon me. All right. Then there's the fact that, again, rethinking the way we think about the Civil War is done in a way to make people more comfortable. And again, we kind of return to this way of coping, right? If you remember your participation or your ancestors' participation in the Civil War as defending the honor of your state, that makes you a lot more comfortable than saying, I or my ancestor fought to continue to enslave other human beings, right? Like, that's an uncomfortable feeling. And a lot of examining history is dealing with uncomfortable things. Because the past is not always sunshine and roses and kittens. Lots of times, like, we do have to wrestle with things that are deeply uncomfortable. And that's just the nature of the past. And if you are not uncomfortable when you study history, Either you're checked out from reality or you're not reading good history. All right. So here's a question. If people today still believe in this interpretation of the Civil War, how can we investigate it? In other words, how can we see how well this stacks up? You'll notice I've already called it a myth, right? So I've tipped my hand that I don't buy this interpretation of the Civil War. Okay, but if you were, because I'm recording this at the time of Thanksgiving, right? We're holidays. Hopefully you are not getting together with your extended family, because during this recording, we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. So hopefully you're being safe. But I know oftentimes holidays, you interact with family members, oftentimes you have different interpretations or about life as you do. How can you respond to somebody who believes in this? How can you kind of interrogate it? One great way to do that is with sources, right? So if we're going to question whether an interpretation of the past is accurate or not, go to the original sources. So in this case, look at some primary and secondary sources, right? So let's talk about slavery. So remember, claims 1 and 2 were both about slavery. The South had fought not to preserve slavery, but for state and local rights, and slavery was not a factor in the war. So how can we look at whether this is true or not? How can we investigate these claims? So I'm going to show you 2 examples of places that you can look at to investigate these claims. One is by looking at the Declaration of Secession. Remember, South Carolina, which if you're ever going to bet money on a state starting shit in American history, South Carolina is the safest bet. South Carolina is the first state to secede on Christmas Eve, 1860. And in seceding, they issue a Declaration of Secession. Think of this as like a breakup letter, right, to the United States saying, it's not me, it's you. Here are all the reasons why I'm leaving you. Okay, so let's look at the Declaration of Secession. So hang on, I'm going to stop presenting for a minute. I'm going to pull up the webpage. All right. Okay. So here we have a website from Yale Law School with the formal name of this document, which is a mouthful: Confederate States of America, Declaration of Immediate Causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the Federal Union. Okay. So what's interesting is that, and we're not going to read all of this. What's interesting is that the very first paragraph actually references the nullification crises, right? By saying frequent violations, here I'll highlight it, frequent violations of the Constitution by the federal government and its encroachment upon the reserved rights of the states fully justify the state then withdrawing from the federal union. So in other words, South Carolina is saying that the federal government has a track record of stomping on state rights and that they had thought about seceding before, but then notice here it says, but in deference to the opinions and wishes of other slaveholding states, she forbore at that time to exercise this right. So in other words, she decided not to secede at that point, she being South Carolina. But now we're revisiting that. Okay. So we go through and we have lots of different discussions of the Revolution, the Constitution. Okay. Now we're getting to the big money maker down here. All right. In the present case, the fact is established with certainty. We assert that 14 of the states have deliberately refused for years past to fulfill their constitutional obligations, and we refer to their own statutes for the proof. So here they're going to lay out their grievances against the national government. Now, here they mention the Constitution. In its 4th article, provides as follows: no person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. this is the Fugitive Slave Clause, right? So what South Carolina is saying is that the Constitution says that if, and notice they never use the word slave, right? A person held in service or labor, so a slave. They say, according to the Constitution says that if a slave flees into a free state, right, any other state, but increasingly a free state, that they are supposed to be returned to their master. Okay. And basically what they're arguing is that the free states, the North, right, which have not allowed slavery anymore, are violating that. Okay. That the northern states are refusing to honor this part of the Constitution. Okay. The Constituted Compact, by which they mean the Fugitive Slave Clause, has been deliberately broken and disregarded by the non-slaveholding states, and the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from her obligation. In other words, released from her obligation to remain part of the United States. Okay. So this is interesting, right? That they're defining their main beef with the federal government as being over the issue of slavery. Okay. So if we're talking, and again, we kind of continue here, they're very verbose, very wordy. So on the issue of, did slavery cause the Civil War? Yes. Now, was the Civil War about states' rights? Yes. States' rights to own slaves. You cannot divorce slavery from the Civil War. Okay, here they're specifically talking about northern states refusing to honor the Fugitive Slave Clause, which had been sort of strengthened in the 1850s with the Compromise of 1850, and that justifies South Carolina leaving. Okay, so for example, they also mentioned the election of Abraham Lincoln, which had happened about a month and a half before the secession. So in this paragraph, they say, for 25 years, this agitation has been steadily increasing until it has now secured to its aid the power of the common government. Observing the forms of the Constitution, a sectional party has found within that article establishing the executive department the means of subverting the Constitution itself. So when they're referring to a sectional party, they're referring to the Republican Party, which is pretty much a northern institution during this time period. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. He is to be entrusted with the administration of the common government because he has declared that, quote, government cannot endure permanently half slave, half free, and that the public mind must rest in the belief that slavery is in the course of ultimate extinction. So they're specifically citing the election of Abraham Lincoln as reason enough for them to leave, because they say, look, the future of slavery is in jeopardy. You've elected a man to office that is hostile to slavery. And in fact, as your textbook mentions, Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in southern states. He won the election because of the population difference between the North and the South, but he did not appear anywhere on southern ballots. So they're specifically referencing slavery in multiple ways here. So states' rights to own slaves is what's at issue here. Okay, so that's one source. Now, the other source that I want to mention, let's see, where is it? Aha. The other source I want to mention, let me pull it the window, is looking at the writings of people during this time period. So that's actually something that you're doing this week. For your week, what week are we on? We are on week 14. For your week 14 assignment, okay, you are, for your sources in history, reading about soldiers and slavery, right? So if we look at this assignment, you're reading a chapter from a secondary source, right? This is from the book For Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought the Civil War by historian James McPherson. But if we look at the file, I'm going to go ahead and open it in the window here. If we look at the file, the source is about, he's looking here at letters from soldiers, right? So even though this is a secondary source, this historian is looking at primary sources, in other words, letters from soldiers back home talking about the topic of slavery and how they felt about it. Okay, so you're looking at that for this week. So that's another thing, right? To see how did the average person, the average soldier fighting in the Civil War, how did they feel about the issue of slavery? You can read that here. Okay, so that's another kind of way to look at the claim about whether the Civil War was fought for slavery or not. All right, now let's see. I don't know why it's not showing me my PowerPoint. Let me reload it. Or you know what we're going to do? We're going to bring it up in PowerPoint. We're screen share this way. All right. Okay. So now let's move on. And let's look at claim number 3. That the fact that the Confederacy was godly and the Union was evil. Now, on this point, again, we probably want to look at the writings of the people involved. And as budding junior historians, right, you're still on your path, right, to become historians, our best kind of ally here is going to be secondary sources. So the National Humanities Center actually has comparisons. They have sections that talk about religion in the North during the Civil War and the South. So let's look at religion. Yes, I want to go ahead and go to this open hyperlink. Yes. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and load both hyperlinks, and then I'm going to switch my screen again. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and flip over to the internet window again. All right. So this here is an article by James Howell Moorhead from the Princeton Theological Seminary on the issue of religion in the North. Okay. And what's interesting about this one is they also have embedded primary sources in here. For example, we have this image, right, that kind of depicts the North as being supported by God. And in particular, he says Northern Protestants. So he's not talking about Catholics here. Northern Protestants had attitudes about religion that kind of break down into 3 key components. The idea of the special place of America in world history, what we would talk about as American exceptionalism, right? Going back to the Puritan idea of America being the city on a hill, right? This example to the rest of the world. There's also a Northern victory as prelude to the millennium. So in other words, believing that if the North won, this would kind of usher in this age of sort of religious prosperity. And then the morality of the issue of slavery. Okay. That these were kind of the 3 things that Northerners focused on. So this article would be a good place to kind of look at the way that Northerners talked about the issue of war when it came to religion. Okay. So this is interesting, right? We're in Thanksgiving as of the week of this recording, right? This Thanksgiving sermon talking about a terrible baptism of blood and fire, referring to the Civil War. Okay. So there is this article in the North. Now, the National Humanities Center also did a companion article talking about religion in the South by another professor at Divinity School, this case Harry Stout, who's a professor of history, religious studies, and American studies, and the Jonathan Edwards Professor of American Christianity at Yale Divinity School. So when we talk about divinity school, we're talking about people who study religion professionally, okay, and teach other religious people. So here he's talking about religion in the South, okay. And in particular, he's saying here this belief in being chosen, okay. And he refers here to the kind of the commonality here. Both the North and the South looked to God for meaning, and each side believed with equal fervor and certitude or certainty that God was on its side. Many ministers, generals, leaders, and editors went so far as to proclaim that God had ordained the war and would determine its length, its damages, and its outcome. The victor would show, in other words, whose side God really supported. So in other words, the victorious party would be the one that God had chosen. New England political and religious leaders had long proclaimed themselves God's chosen people. With the start of the Civil War, Southerners laid claim to the title, and through speech, print, and ritual actions proceeded to prove their claim. So this is really interesting, that both sides believe that, at least during the Civil War, that whoever wins will be the side that God supported. So in other words, if we're investigating the claim, right, that Southerners were more godly and the Union was evil, that doesn't seem to bear out already. Because during the Civil War, people are saying, you know what, we believe God's on our side, but ultimately, whoever wins, that'll be who God favored. Okay, so the Union won. And so clearly that would indicate that the Union must therefore be favored. Okay, but it's kind of interesting talking about all of this, that both sides really believe in the power of religion and that God is on their side. Okay, so this is another really sort of interesting way to look at this. All right, so we have that. And then if we, where is it? Go back. And then if we look at the last claim, here we go. Then if we look at the last claim here, the idea of Reconstruction is a time of rampant corruption and Black rule, that's something we're actually going to get to next week when we cover the Reconstruction. So that's a claim that we're not going to investigate today, in part because we haven't got there yet. Okay, so we will look at that claim next week. So far, when it comes to the claims of the lost cause, we'll pull them up again. The idea that the South did not fight to preserve slavery and that slavery was not a factor in the war does not hold up, right? When we look at the South Carolina Declaration of Secession, when you look at the chapter from For Cause and Comrades in your sources of history assignment, that doesn't hold water, right? That doesn't appear to be the case. When we talk about this notion of religion and this belief that the Confederacy was kind of backed by God and that the Union was evil, that doesn't seem to bear up either when we look at secondary sources talking about religion and how people are discussing religion in the Civil War. So spoiler alert, this doesn't hold up either. This idea of Reconstruction state level governments being horribly corrupt and that Black people misruled over white people is not going to hold up either. Okay. Nevertheless, the lost cause is exceedingly powerful. And to give you an idea of the power of this, I'm going to wrap up by talking about this dude here. Okay, so this statue is called Silent Sam. Silent Sam stood on the campus of University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in one of their main squares. My husband got his PhD from University of Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so we lived in that area for a while. And this square where Silent Sam stood was really close to kind of the edge of campus and sort of downtown Chapel Hill. So it was a very prominent place. I walked by it a lot. So this statue of Silent Sam was put up on campus as a memorial to the servants, or the servants, the students who served as soldiers in the Confederacy during the Civil War, because North Carolina was one of the southern states that seceded. And like many Confederate monuments that are standing today, Silent Sam was not put up until 1913, so several decades after the Civil War. We don't really see Confederate memorials built during Reconstruction. It tends to be a phenomenon that's later. So Silent Sam is put up in 1913, and he faces north. So he has his rifle at the ready. He's facing north to defend the university from Yankees. Okay. And at this commemoration, we have various speakers kind of coming up and talking about the valiant service by these students in defending the states' rights, right, of North Carolina, and really in talking about the issue of slavery. They don't talk so much about the issue of slavery and more about the issue of race. So, for example, Julian Carr, who's really big. In fact, Carrboro, the town next to Chapel Hill, is named after him. Julian Carr gives a speech. He had served in the Confederacy. He was the single largest donor towards building on the monument. He talks about how he felt that people were not sufficiently thankful or remembering the Confederacy. He says the present generation scarcely takes note of what the Confederate soldier meant to the welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race, by which he means white people, during the 4 years immediately succeeding the war. Their courage and steadfastness saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South. When he talks about the 4 years succeeding the war, this is a reference to the Ku Klux Klan, the secretive organization that arises out of Tennessee, founded by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, that terrorized people. We'll talk more about that next week. Later in the speech, he kind of refers again to this notion of white supremacy by saying this: 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, by which he means a white lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings where was stationed a garrison of 100 Federal soldiers. I performed the pleasing duty, by which he was referring to whipping her, in this immediate presence of the entire garrison, and for 30 nights afterwards slept with a double-barreled shotgun under my head. That he whipped her in front of these Federal troops and basically was prepared to defend himself. Okay. So this monument, needless to say, was very controversial on campus. For many years, students protested the existence of the Silent Sam statue. And what ends up happening is that students topple Silent Sam back in 2018. So I'm going to share another screen with you. Okay. So we're going to see whether the New York Times actually lets me view this. So students bring down Silent Sam after many days of protesting, okay, in August 2018. And this is a news article from earlier this year, from February 14th, 2020. When students tore down Silent Sam, in the image that you can see here, the difficulty is that the state of North Carolina had passed legislation that basically said you cannot remove Confederate war memorials unless they are a danger to public safety. Student activists made the argument that so long as it was standing, it would attract protests that had the potential to turn violent, and therefore it was a threat to public safety and should be removed. The university, however, and it looks like I can't read the whole article, just the stub, but I'll recap it for you. The university initially thought that they could make a deal with an organization called the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And that they had initially drafted this deal to give Silent Sam, which is still being stored in an undisclosed location, to give Silent Sam to this group, and also to give this group $2.5 million in a trust to go towards displaying Silent Sam somewhere off campus. That deal has since fallen through. It was proven by student activists that the university had kind of colluded behind the scenes with this group, and this was not a sort of publicly conducted transaction, that there was a lot of kind of shady things going on. So Silent Sam still remains off his pedestal, but in deep storage somewhere. And a lot of people objected to the fact of spending millions of dollars to display this statue. So this is just one example of how the lost cause is kind of reverberated here, that people who still believe in the lost cause make the argument that Silent Sam should be put back on his pedestal on campus because it is memorializing those who fought to preserve states' rights, and that it was not all about slavery. When, again, if we look at the dedication speech by folks like Julian Carr, and we look at the experience of North Carolina Chapel Hill, a university literally built on the backs of slaves, where a slave graveyard later became a parking lot, this is definitely something that is problematic. And the narrative over how we remember the Civil War continues. We saw another round of statue toppling in the summer of 2020, following the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd. And we're going to continue to have this conversation about how we should remember the Civil War. Because there are some folks who say, well, these statues that we have were put up much later. The context is very different. It's a context of Jim Crow segregation, the rise of white supremacy again, and this misremembering of the Civil War. And on the other hand, we also have folks who make the argument that by taking down these statues, we are somehow erasing history. Some institutions, like the University of Texas at Austin, have struck a balance. They actually removed Confederate statues from campus, from their places on campus, and put them in the campus museum. I'm sorry, my dogs are so loud today. Put them in the campus museum with context. In other words, putting up plaques to talk about the history behind this statue and the history behind this person. In other words, to kind of fully cover like both the good, the bad, and the ugly of these statues. So to kind of sum up, the lost cause way of remembering the Civil War has been very persistent, despite the fact that when we examine it, when we look at the past and we look at the things that people said about the war, why they fought it, what they believed in, the lost cause doesn't stack up. But it's still a very powerful myth because it makes people feel better about a very divisive issue within America's past, and it makes people who again had ancestors who fought in the Civil War feel better. If you can say, well, my great grandpappy fought to defend Southern honor, that's a lot better than saying my great grandpappy fought because he didn't want to free his slaves. So this is definitely something that continues to be contentious in American history. Again, Reconstruction informs a lot of this. We're going to talk more about Reconstruction next week in our final week of class. But until then, I'm Dr. Esmacher.